Good evening, and even though it's the 20th of January, I haven't seen most of you for a while, so Happy New Year. Pretty big day today. It's just a weird, I don't know, I just sort of started watching it and thinking this is just so weird. And just texting some of my friends in the US saying, what's the vibe, how are you feeling? And I think, to be honest, I think a lot of people are a little dumbfounded, but also like, we need to rethink because our tactics have not been working. And last time, there was a sense of we're going to do mass protest, but I think this time, what I'm hearing from my friends there is that, you know, there's just a bit of a rethink about how they're going to manage and how they're going to handle this. But so brilliant to have this today, and actually it was Gary's idea to also speak a bit about the US and speak about Trump. So we'll get into all of that. Just for those of you that are new, and there's some new people here, welcome. So these conversations came out of the campaign that we ran last year now, 2024, to have an independent MP here in Chingford and Woodford Green. Some of you will know the story. I won't get into it. But it just energized so many people got involved that hadn't got involved in politics before, and we didn't want to just end it there. We wanted to continue with fighting for local community assets, including, unfortunately, we had some bad news today that West Streeting announced that Whipps Cross Hospital, which had been promised would be rebuilt again and again and again, has been pushed to start in 2032. I think that's right, Norma? Yeah. So, you know, and so we really need to keep fighting. And so, yeah, I was born in Whipps Cross. Those of you that have been to Whipps Cross recently, it's not in a good way at all. So in order to stay together and have a place for those of us that want real change, that are not scared to talk about Palestine, that want to, you know, really push and don't accept austerity economics, that we need a space for that. We need a physical space where we come and see each other, and where we plan, where we communicate, where we think about ideas. And so these are our monthly events where we get a speaker, and we've been totally blessed with incredible speakers so far. And also an opportunity to meet each other and speak, because, you know, change really comes from community. I completely believe that, and I've seen that through the years. So thank you for coming, and thank you for using this cold Monday evening to come and listen and to lean in. I know the world is a difficult place, and so many have switched off, so it's great to have you here. Where do I start on introducing Gary Younge? Someone I've admired for so long, and I kind of pinch myself that we're sort of friends now. At least I pretend you are my friend, at least. I have your number, which maybe. So award-winning author, journalist, broadcaster, and currently a professor of sociology in Manchester University of Manchester. I was just telling him that some of my colleagues at LSE were saying to me, we're so jealous that they got Gary Younge. We should have got Gary Younge. Yeah, and so, you know, formerly columnist at The Guardian, which are probably when most of us started reading his stuff, and genuinely, and I know my husband says this too, we both grew up in East London, where he grew up in Tottenham, just one of the few people that we would like wait for his column to come out, because we knew that he would articulate not just how we felt, but take us further in our thinking, and just be that voice that we so desperately wanted to hear from through the years. So I think I started reading your stuff, yeah, in the early noughties or something, and so a huge influence on me and my politics. So thank you so much for joining us today, and I think this huge crowd at Capacity Hall is testament to how much people want to hear from you. I should say as well that Gary won the 2023 prize for the All-World Prize for Journalism, which is pretty cool. Okay, so in one of his books, from Nelson Mandela to BLM to Black Lives Matter, I think it's particularly pertinent tonight because I think for a lot of us, when the Black Lives Matter George Floyd moment especially happened, and the movement that came out of that, and how much anger there was, and the protests, it felt like maybe something will shift. And yet, here we are, not just the US, but the UK, with the rise of far-right politics. We had these horrible, scary riots just last summer, which I think has sort of been a bit forgotten, but I think for a lot of communities, just knowing that that can happen at any moment, that kind of level of violence, people stopping cars and pulling people out, pretty scary situation. I think, there's a need to think about where we are in terms of fighting racism, and I did warn Gary that I don't feel too good about it, I have to say. So I'm hoping Gary can either give us some hope or tell us what to do. But let's start with what happened today and the inauguration and Trump. And you spent a lot of time out in the US. I forget. Do you want to stand up, Gary? I forget how long was it?
12 years.
12 years. Wow. Okay. So you were there just before Obama was elected. Is that right?
I was there just before the Iraq War. So from 2003 to 2015.
Okay. Wow. Okay. So tell us, Gary.
What?
How are we here all over again with Trump?
Well, I mean, I think there are a few things to bear in mind. The first is to understand America in its proper historical context. Right? It was a slave state for several hundred years. It was an apartheid state for 100 years. Non-racial democracy is a relatively new concept to that country. It's actually a relatively new concept to this country too, but this country had most of its most egregious anti-black racism abroad, whereas America had it at home. And so the entire polity is organized around, among other things, racism. And that was as true for the Democrats as it was for the Republicans. What's his name? Bill Clinton, before he's elected in 1992, flies back to Arkansas so that he can be in his home state when Willie Ray Rector, who is a man who murdered someone and who was half lobotomized and not well, so that he could be at home when Willie Ray Rector is executed. Because he says they will never, what do they call it? They will never outdo me on crime, basically. That Willie Ray Rector, so ill that with his last meal, he says about the dessert, "I'll leave it for later." And he wants to be back in Arkansas. So Democrats as well as Republicans played this game. And the Democrats thought, well, who else have African Americans got to vote for? And Republicans, in 67, 68, Nixon's guy, Haldeman, his chief of staff, says, you gotta accept that the basic problem is the blacks. And then you have to devise a method to say that without actually saying it. So they talk about welfare queens, or gun crime, or all of this stuff just means black people, right? And what's happened with Trump is that they've gone from the dog whistle to the wolf whistle. They're just saying it out loud now. And the reason that they're saying it out loud and they're saying it so feverishly is because, as far as they are concerned, then we're into replacement theory, the clock is ticking. White people are going to be a minority within the next 20 odd years. If you look at the places that are now swing states, Arizona, which wasn't a swing state before, New Mexico's already gone. It was New Mexico was closer in 2000 than Florida, but now it's a Democratic state that people don't talk about it anymore. But Nevada, Arizona, North Carolina, these are all places that are newly contested states, Georgia, because of a growth of the Latino population as well as the black population. So there is a kind of feverishness now, which is galvanizing. And the Democrats had no answer to an awful lot of that, right? That they had been in power for 4 years. During those 4 years, for reasons that can be explained but can't be excused, in terms of COVID and what they did on COVID, they couldn't get the economy right. And so people were like, well, I'm worse off now than I was 4 years ago. This notion of Trump being a disruptor, I remember in the 2016 campaign, Trump saying, make America great again, Hillary saying America's already great, and lots of people thinking, well, it's not great for me. Wages have stagnated. My life is going to be worse than my children's, which was always a promise that America had until the previous 20 years before the crash, was your life, your children's life will be better than yours. Maybe you didn't go to college, but your children will. That this notion of unrelenting progress, which basically stalled and then went backwards with the crash of 2008. So they didn't deliver. And then Trump comes in as we know he's a racist and all of those things, but also he comes in as a disruptor. Things will not be the same as they are now if you elect me. And enough people, frankly, not enough people showed up for the Democrats. That's what happened. People stayed at home. It wasn't that Trump massively improved his score. The Democrats lost votes. And in that sense, and this kind of brings it full circle, there are really worrying portents there for us, right? You have a centre-left government, or a government that claims to be centre-left, that doesn't deliver, that leaves people despondent, so people don't show up. But then you have a right that is energized through bigotry, false promises, and so on. And to win an election, and we know this from the way that Starmer won the election here, you don't need to actually even do better than Corbyn did in 2019. You just have to beat them in the electoral sphere that you're in. And so, that's what happened. It wasn't a landslide. He got less than 50% of the votes. And it wasn't a rush towards Trump. People stayed at home. There wasn't enough to vote for. So it was our loss. We lost it. They didn't win it.
I was reflecting with a friend about kind of where we've got to after the kind of height of the Black Lives Matter movement. How much do you think that inadvertently that actually helped the far right, or that they were able to use it much better than the left and progressives were able to use it?
See, I don't know about that. I think that a lot of what we're seeing is still a response to the crash, actually, and a failure to produce a decent response to that. And I do think there's been this challenge. It's exposed. Black Lives Matter exposed this challenge, although it wasn't unique to anti-racism, which is the capacity that we have shown to win arguments and lose ground, to clear space and not to build on it. So Black Lives Matter did clear a lot of space. It rallied a large number of people around a basic idea. It changed people's minds. People's opinions about racism did change. And if you look at things like, I'm 56. It's between us.
No.
I'm old enough to think that, albeit symbolic, To have the England football team take a knee is a huge thing.
Yeah.
Football, when I was growing up, was a thing that I couldn't go to because you'd get your head smacked in. I was chased off a train by football supporters as I came home to Stevenage. I was 15 years old. These were grown men trying to beat the shit out of me. So to have an England football team that does that is impressive. So we cleared space, but then we couldn't build on it.
Yeah.
And
Why do you think that is?
well, I think the black community doesn't have the institutions, and
Here and the US, or
no, in the US they have more of
Yeah,
of the institutions. We don't have any long-standing institutions here. Maybe Indian Workers Association. There are things, but they're usually kind of quite small. Which could incubate that energy, and we became satisfied with symbolic victories, which is where the taking the knee comes in. It's like, okay, that's great. It is really great. It meant a lot to me. It's a symbol of something. Like, take down the Colston statue, that's great. But Colston statue was a symbol of racism. So if our schools are still crap, and our housing is still, our access to housing and health and all those things are still unequal, then at a certain point, taking down a statue, if you'd gone around Bristol and said, what's your priority right now? No one would have said statues, right? Which doesn't mean that it wasn't a good thing that it was taken down. It doesn't mean that symbols don't matter, but what it does mean is that they can't be replaced for substance. And
have we not been ambitious enough, do you think? Because one of the things we just said was in Trump's speech, for those of you that listened, he said he's going to get rid of diversity equality programs in government. And we were saying, like, I'm majorly critical of those, but then it's like, but now he's getting rid of even those. So,
well, I mean, I think a lack of ambition in general has been a real problem for the left. And this issue of symbolic victories and kind of lack of institutions, I think that is also similarly true for Occupy Wall Street. I think it was, in a way, true for Me Too, that we have these moments, they burn very brightly, and then they fade, and then we recreate another thing, which is almost doing the same thing as the last thing. Each one is different. So I don't think it's limited to racism, but I think that a lack of ambition has been a general problem for quite some time. And that if we take diversity, equality, inclusion initiatives, this would be an example where something is fought for, like BLM, which then gets incorporated into corporations and institutions and formalized. But what they are is not anti-racist, right? It's about looking different and acting the same. I remember interviewing Angela Davis, and it was as Obama was rising, and she said, there is a model of diversity in this moment that's the difference that brings no difference and the change that makes no change. And there was a real lesson in the way that people understood Obama, and some people did it again with Meghan Markle, weirdly, where they take this moment, this symbolic moment, and they say, oh, this is wonderful. And my son was born the same weekend that Obama declared, and we lived in New York. And people would say, oh, this will be great for your son. And I would always say, why? Which was really like being invited to someone's house and pissing in the sink. because it was supposed to be obvious. And I was like, would you be rejoicing if Condoleezza Rice was the candidate? And they were like, well, no. So, okay, so it's not just because he's black then. So then what I want to know is, what's he going to do for my kid? Is he going to have things that are going to keep him out of jail? Is he going to do things that will make it more likely that he'll succeed? Is he going to close the gap? Is he going to stop him being shot? Otherwise, I can see what it does for Obama, but what good is it for me? But we didn't, generally speaking, have those conversations. And when I wrote that kind of thing in The Guardian, I was called Eeyore. And it was like, I'll kind of get with it, be happy. And I'm like, look, the symbolic stuff, I'm all for it. I love it. I love the, you know, the good vibes.
Yeah.
You know, you're not going to go to Harlem and say to people, stop dancing in the street, go back home, build a fighting alternative. Do you know what I mean? What the fuck is that? So, no, I was pleased. But I wasn't going to claim anything for it. I mean, Meghan Markle's a bit of a no-brainer, right? It's like, look, really, all she's done is marry a posh guy.
And an institution.
In the year of Windrush, and we are now going to celebrate that as what exactly? But that's...
Progress, I think.
That's what they said.
That worked out well.
But I do think that there is a lesson there about how careful we need to be about how we understand these moments. Because then, you know, Kemi Badenoch or Rishi Sunak comes along and people are like, well, if Obama's election was really important, why isn't this election? Why isn't this elevation important? And that's on us. That's on us. Because there is nobody being strapped to their plane seat about to be flown to wherever who's saying, well, at least an Asian woman did this. That's the good news. You know, this is progress. So we've been all too often, all too easily bought off with things that look different but don't change much. And to the extent that we've allowed ourselves to do that, that's on us.
No, I agree. I also do think, and to give them credit, that the right has done a very, very good job of telling the story of change, which involves getting rid of those programs, you know, stopping immigration, that they have a very clear narrative of what they want to do and how it will impact people's lives. And when we did work a few years ago looking at the race-class narrative in the UK, and what really struck us is how easy it was to find their narrative, that the reason things are wrong and, you know, the white working class is left behind and all of that stuff. It was so easy to find their story, and when we looked for a progressive story or the left story, we literally couldn't find it. We had a researcher on it for months. We couldn't find what our story was. And so I do think there is some credit there, both in the US and here and all over the world, and the work that I've done, that I've seen the right very clearly articulate what society should be. I
mean, I wouldn't give them as much credit as that, just because, and we've seen this. Well, there was this interesting moment with Cameron during the Brexit campaign, where he suddenly was like, what the fuck is this? Because suddenly he had the press against him. Suddenly the media were not, and so I don't know that they're that great, the right. And if you look at, say, how the Republicans have done, since 1988, they've won the popular vote twice.
Yeah.
Once in 2004 and once this time.
If it wasn't for Trump, I think, what do you think? I mean, I think there is a bit of Trump as an individual and his character. There is
a bit of that, but that kind of, they're not, you know, I don't think that they are that formidable, but I think that when you have an entire system and an entire media class which will tell whatever fucking story you want, flying people to Rwanda, whose idea was that? That is mental. Let's bomb Iraq, let us get involved in this, like selling a total lie. Like bombing Iraq. And we see these moments, and I would say Black Lives Matter was one. I'd say the way that public opinion has been about Palestine would be another one, where people are actually kind of being bombarded with this stuff, and they're saying, actually, No. You know, majority of British people have been pro-ceasefire for most of this war. The press haven't. Yeah. And we saw in 2017 this onslaught against Labour under Corbyn and all that, and it didn't work. And so I do think the left is poor at telling stories, and I do think we have a story, we have a few.
Yeah.
But I don't think the right are that good at it. I just think they have power on their side, and that makes a very big difference. If I thought that even 20% of the things that they said about Corbyn were true, I wouldn't vote for him either, right? And we see their share of the vote go down and down. We see the thinness. They had a massive majority. No, Labour has a massive majority, and nobody really likes any of them.
Oh yeah, you get that a lot on the doorstep, which is hence why I guess independents did, you know, remarkably well, historically well. I mean, 5 independent MPs. Yeah, I mean, that's part of the issue, isn't it? There's this kind of mass despondency. And many of you that came out to Do Not Care, we kind of heard that quite a lot, like they're all the same. And then I think, you know, things are not going well and people feel that even more now. I wonder, like we talk about, I mean, and certainly you see that in the US. I know we keep talking about the US and UK kind of interchangeably. But do you see them as very different when it comes to fighting racism, when it comes to how the far right is gaining or strengthening even?
Yeah, I do. I think they are quite different. I think the right wing here is less well organised. I think black people are also less well organised. I think that there is a different idea of Britishness than Americanness, which just takes its racism in a different direction. It's not that one is less racist than the other, but they are differently racist. And America has a more lethal kind of... American life is more lethal. Everything about America is more lethal. Domestic violence is more lethal. You know, childhood fights are more lethal because they've got fucking loads of guns. Yeah. So, and then there's also the thing that I started with, the fact that it's so recent that my wife is African American. So her parents grew up under segregation. If my kids want to learn about what it was like to grow up in a segregated apartheid state, they just have to ask their grandparents. It's not that long ago. And so the organizations that kept, segregation is still a thing. Of course it is. It'd be like going to South Africa and expecting after, where are we now? We're into 31 years after Mandela was elected, that somehow those townships will be multicultural. Of course they're not. So, I mean, what America does a very good job of is reinvention. And what's interesting about this moment is how retrospective it is. Make America great again. It's not forward-looking, it's backward-looking. And that is making it more like Britain, because our racism is incredibly backward-looking and actually thrives on a certain kind of ignorance that they couldn't get away with in America because it all happened there. Right? So in 1948, the year that Windrush docked, the Colonial Office did a survey of British people to find out what they knew about the empire. This is 1948. India had gone, but Britain ran most of Africa and the Caribbean and some of Asia. Half of British people could not name a single colony. Right? At least one person offered that Lincolnshire was a colony. So when people talk about, it's amnesia, and it's not amnesia. Amnesia is something that happens to people as they kind of get older, they get whacked on the head. This is a country that is able to forget what it's doing and where it's been in real time, even while it's doing it. And so that quote from aphorism from Sivanandan when he says, well, we are here because you were there in terms of immigration. Well, if you didn't know you were there, then how do you understand that we're here?
Yeah.
You know, and that's as true for post-war immigration as it is for, say, refugees and asylum seekers. It's like, well, we bombed their bloody country. I mean, you know, a lot of those asylum seekers from Afghanistan, from Iraq, even as we were doing it, people say, well, we can't let in all the world's misery. And it's like, well, then don't fucking create the world's misery. If you don't want it coming here, then don't, you know, this is obviously intimately tied to our foreign policy. But even while we're doing it, we've managed to kind of, you know, have this sense that somehow we're besieged. And it's not even like we are the country that people are most likely to go to. Like, there are much poorer countries that are struggling with a much bigger problem. But so the racism is different, because racism is a bit like a language with many dialects, and they just speak it. In America speaks it differently, but in both places it's getting worse. And in that sense, Britain isn't really unique on the continent. It's even worse in other places. In other places, reform has already won, right? In Italy, in Sweden, in Holland, those kind of parties are the biggest party. So we're not even the worst, and it's still pretty bad.
I was just thinking, whilst you were speaking, you've been a storyteller for all these years, but how much because I kind of feel a bit torn. Sometimes I think, you know, I look at this room, I look at what we were able to achieve in a very short campaign, and think, wow, you know, there's so much energy for change. There's so many people that feel the same. There's so many people that, you know, want to hear this stuff, that want to listen. And then on the other hand, I just think, oh my God, you know, am I just like hitting my head against a brick wall? I mean, how have you felt in, you know, trying to tell this different story, trying to, you know, lay out the reality of racism and why, you know, people like you and me are here? Do people want to hear it?
Well, you know, I think there's a story about disadvantage that doesn't come easily from me or you. I'm the disadvantaged professor, you know, with a full-time job, right? So but I do think that there is a context that people are ready for, and that they can. I think we underestimate people, and that there is, and that was to me what was the power of Black Lives Matter, and some of that genie doesn't go back into the bottle. I think of it less as like we're getting better or worse, and it's more like a sea. It goes up and it goes down, and you're trying to raise the level of the tide in a sense. But I think that there is a story that one can tell. It wouldn't necessarily, you know, nobody's going to get me to run a party anytime soon. So, but one that says this is a great country, and what makes it a great country, in part, is potentially our maturity. And maturity means understand that you've done good things and bad. That our role in this world has been, in a range of ways, we have done brilliant things. And of course, we've done terrible things. And to be a mature country, one has to understand both of those things, and that, you know, we don't have to fetishize the bad things any more than we should fetishize the good things. We should celebrate who we are, because people should always celebrate who we are, but we should do it mindfully. And you know, and a story that kind of I mean, the story I tell a story which does center myself, my favorite kind of story. But that I say, look, I was born in 1969. My dad left when I was 1. My mum had 3 boys by that stage. I was the youngest. And she would dance us around the room and sing to Young, Gifted and Black by Bob and Marcia. like there was no prospect of, this was the early 70s, it was a rough time. It was a rough time for everybody. And there was no prospect, particularly of these three boys from a single mum. Single parenthood was not a popular thing at the time, was not a regular thing at the time. And so we had to imagine a world in which we might live, and then just assume that we would be part of it. And that I am the product of that imagination. And that imagination itself could never have been enough. That I was also the product of free school meals. Somebody fought for that. I had a hernia when I was 8. I went to the hospital, I came home, nobody was bankrupt. Somebody fought for that. My mum was an epileptic, nocturnal epileptic. She got her meds, she stayed in work, first as a nurse, then as a teacher. Somebody fought for that. I went to university, I got a full grant. Somebody fought for that. Yeah. And so I didn't just get here because my mum was really energetic and I really worked very hard. All of those things can be true, but it's not, none of it's going to be enough. Other people who didn't know what name I would carry fought for the possibility that I might exist. And so I danced here on their dreams. And that's a story that one can tell about Britain, of the great shit that we fought for, of the brilliant things that we've done communally. The NHS is more popular than the royal family. It's not difficult, but still true. So, and we see little glimpses of it. I think in the opening of the Olympic Games, there was this sense of like, that could be a story that we could tell ourselves. But generally speaking, I don't even want to call them the left, what the centre does, the centre-left, is that they go to Murdoch and others and they say, what story could you put up with? What story are we allowed to tell? And then they trial balloon something fucking really milquetoast, and they say, no, you're out of line with that. And they say, okay, well, what can we do? Well, that's not how good stories are told.
Yeah. No, it's just so even nice to hear that story, because we're so starved of stories, that make us feel sort of proud and part of something. And it happened a couple of times, this was Northern territory. It happened a couple of times over the years campaigning here, and an element of immigration, sort of anti-immigration, without saying came up on the doorstep. And one thing I always like to say is that actually mine and your history goes back. We've been entangled for centuries. And, just as my grandparents and great-grandparents and, before that paid taxes and paid money into the UK, so did you. And often, we were the global working class. And so there is that story as well, that we've been connected for so long.
Yeah.
And I remember one time saying it to this elderly gentleman, and he wasn't going to vote for me, but he was like, yes, I guess I haven't thought about it that way, that's true. And it's just that no one says it, right?
Well, yeah, and that we don't. So my mum came to the country in '62. She had a British passport. She wasn't an immigrant.
Yeah, absolutely. My dad used to sing the British anthem in Fiji, all the way in Fiji. Yeah.
I mean, the border crossed her. She didn't cross the border. But I've still got her UK passport. She studied bloody The Winter's Tale for A-level. She's never seen snow. She lived in Barbados. So there's a story. And I do think that one mistake that we make in the anti-racist storytelling is not connecting it to other stories. Is sometimes giving the impression that our pain is not just particular, but unique. And so there are other people in pain who are like, well, yeah, we're all suffering. And that's why in that story that I told, I mean, it's true, I'm not making it up, but that the stuff about the NHS and free school meals all that are as important to my capacity to be here as because I stopped at a certain point, but there was the mid-80s riots. That's why The Guardian, in the same way that they're getting rid of DEI now because of politics, politics brought it in. So The Guardian set up a bursary scheme because they could see that there were writing about there were young black people in the news, but not in the newsroom. And I was one of the first beneficiaries of that scheme. I got my column in 1999. Same year Yasmin Alibhai-Brown got her column. Same year that Steve McQueen won the Turner Prize. Year before was Chris O'Feely. Year after that, White Teeth came out. That was also the year of the McPherson Report. And of course, I work hard. And, you know, but the notion that me working hard is what made all of that happen for me or for anybody else. No, there were people working hard before me. So there are these moments of opportunity, and there are these connections that it's up to us to make, and also up to the trade union movement and organised working class to make, because they may not be obvious to everybody, not least given the incoming from the rest of the media.
So I'm going to open up to questions. I mean, I'm enjoying this conversation so much, but I know that people here will have questions and thoughts. But where are you putting your energies these days, Gary? And where do you think we should be putting our energies?
Well, one thing that I'm doing, which is kind of part of my job, although it's kind of taking over really, is organising. I've organised 4 public assemblies around the country, most of which are taking place in February and March, around issues of racism. Because I got sick of 2 things: the racial conversation in the country being buffeted by what Piers Morgan said or Kemi Badenoch said or whatever, and you know, you turn on the Today programme, which I never do, but isn't this political correctness gone mad? And, you know, isn't that world?
Is racism real?
Yeah, all of that.
Is Britain racist?
Yeah, exactly.
We're
all
still
of that
stuck on those
horse
questions.
shit. Yeah. So I was sick of that, and I was also sick of the kind of people who should be on our side saying, "Oh my God, I don't believe that they said this," or that, and I'm like, of course they fucking said. That's what they do. Why are you being you're allowing yourself to be gaslit? This is where we are. This is what they do. The question is, what are we doing? And so, driven by a desire to have a better conversation than the one that was being shown to us, I argued in a piece that, well, we should have these meetings. And we had one as a pilot in Bristol, and it was really good. There were 150 people. It was over 4 hours. They ended up having another one afterwards. It was in St Paul. So we're doing 4 more in Nottingham, Glasgow, Birmingham, and Manchester area over the next few months, which is a lot of work and also involves a lot of dealing with the public, which I'm not brilliant at actually, in terms of just you know running things.
Yeah.
And electorally, I don't know, you know. And in a sense, and what I like about this is that kind of politics, we often mistake the electoral for the political. And I think this country is in a much better shape politically than it is electorally. I think we don't actually have very good choices electorally. And our electoral system makes sure that what choices we have are then skewed in a way that doesn't really reflect what anybody wants. I mean, as for what you should do, who would I be to tell you what you should? I mean, in a sense, you're doing it, right? You haven't stopped. You had that awful, shameful experience, shameful for them, not for you, which you resisted, and you came out swinging, and even though you didn't win, and yet you're not defeated, and that's kind of who we have to be, right? So that you could imagine Martin Luther King gets to the top of the Lincoln Memorial, August 28th, 1963, and he doesn't have a dream. He has a 10-point plan. And that 10-point plan will get him from here to here, and he can get it through Congress. It's good politics, and it's incremental. And instead, he doesn't do that. Instead, he says this thing which is absolutely crazy. Right? Little black boys and little black girls should be able to play with each other. And like, I have a dream that America won't be like this anymore. Within about a month, 4 little girls are firebombed to death in Birmingham while they're at Sunday school. That's the country that they're living in. And similarly, people might have said, do you think that the March on Washington is what prompted this to happen? And in a way it was. In a way, the assassination of those kids and what happens later in the 60s with, well, you have Lyndon Johnson, but then you have Nixon, was a response to the growth in civil rights. So there was a backlash. Trouble this time is we didn't even have a lash. Right? We just went straight to, we didn't have much of a lash, we went straight to backlash. But the idea that you might stand there, he might stand there, and evoke this world that doesn't exist and say, come with me to this world, we can do this. We need that. Most of the stuff that Trump says he's going to do, he's not going to do, but people like the idea, or some people like the idea of it.
Yeah, I mean, look at Farage, who's already played in a bit as well. I mean.
Yeah, but the kind of, in the left, the electoral left dares not dream. It's like they take Quaaludes before they go to bed and just let out. And any dream that anybody else has, they crush. And that's where the lack of hope comes. And in that little period when, and I don't think it was the second coming, Corbyn's leadership of the Labour Party. I think there were a lot of problems with it. And there was just that flicker of hope that something else was possible. It was a kind of milquetoast agenda that he had, really. It was a boilerplate social democratic. Both times that manifesto wouldn't have looked out of place in a centre-right party in most of Europe. And yet, people, like in 2016, were like, oh, okay. And to me, just that little it was like a glitch in the Matrix.
Yeah.
But you had a sense of what might be possible. And the idea that it fell first time round, second time round, if you're just talking electorally, doesn't really surprise me. The idea that it was possible surprises me. Because the idea that it was possible shows me that there is a country in there that that is not being reflected and that is not being amplified, but that is desperate for the kind of ideas that we have, but that we struggle to cohere into an electoral political force.
Okay, thank you, Gary. Oh my gosh. I could just listen to you all day. So what we're doing with these things, just because we do want you guys to talk to each other, is just to take 5 minutes, have a chat to the person next to you, think about what you might want to ask or some thoughts, and then I'm going to open it up to questions at past. And there's tea and biscuits at the back, so you're really British. Do that, go and get that. Yeah, so chat to each other for 5 minutes. So we have a mic. Where this very so Adam's very keen to start us off at the front, but I'm going to take 3 at a time. So do people want to raise hands? A couple of more hands. Yeah. All right. Cool. Well, let's start. Take these 3 here, and then we'll move to the back. Yeah.
Hi. Thank you for the wonderful chat. I wanted to ask about Palestine, ceasefire, and the pretty nasty crackdown by the police at the last protest march. And which direction do you think this movement is going to go in?
Given the demonization of the Latino and African American communities as far as criminality is concerned, and the demonization of the Muslim community as far as grooming gangs are concerned, why do you think that there isn't the same level of opprobrium heaped on communities that have produced Jeffrey Epstein, Harvey Weinstein, Michael Milken, Bernie Madoff in America, and the Anglican Church in this country?
Thank you.
We do need that because everyone can hear. Yeah.
Mine was, you mentioned that you didn't think the right were very well organised. I worry about that with Reform, who are getting a lot of publicity from the media and do seem to have money and getting organised, and with a potential by-election coming up, apparently already flooding the constituency with leaflets, have a centre there, and it seems that they are getting organised, they have the money to do it, and what do you think, I mean, hopefully we should be doing about it?
Taking your point first, without wanting to quibble, but I don't think I said they weren't organised. I just think they're not as good as Faiza was saying. I think they've got a lot of money. That's something that they've never particularly had, that they've never particularly lacked. But they need a lot of money because what they're trying to sell is Christmas to turkeys, right? So they need all the money that that they can get. I do also think, though, even though I hadn't said it, I just don't think they're as well organised as we think. I think that this summer, as vile as it was, actually suffered from the same thing that Black Lives Matter suffered from, in terms of there was no centre, there was no central organisation. There are a bunch of organisations that want to catch up with it, but that didn't come out of Tommy Robinson's group. It didn't come out of Reform. This was, obviously these people are energised by the rhetoric that comes from these people, but they didn't organise it. It was freelance. And that's kind of what makes it so potentially dangerous as well as just awful now, that if someone can cohere that and organise it, then we're in real trouble. But no, money is something that they have. And Elon Musk is prepared to pour millions into it. I'm not complacent about their potential at all, but I do think that we grant them too much. Intelligence is not quite the right word, but nous, in terms of like, well, why can the Tories do this and we can't do that? And it's like, well, if we had the press doing what they're doing, if we had the BBC and others doing what they're doing, if we had kind of a couple of centuries of capitalism behind us, do you know what I mean? Or a couple of centuries of a system that supported what we were saying, it would be much easier. And we don't.
Can I just push you on this a little bit, Gary, just because I think part of why people worry about reform so much is because there isn't the kind of antithesis to reform in our kind of electoral system, at least. And so, when we hear that reform is organising in Merthyr Tydfil and here and there, and actually know that Labour isn't willing to stand up to it, in fact, is willing to play into it, I think that sense of fear also comes from like, but then who's going to voice how we feel, you know? And I think it comes back to your point about telling stories, but then, and in a way changing the conversation, because the media is not going to give us the conversation that we want. No, so how do we do that? And I think that's why I feel it. It's not that I necessarily think that they're unbeatable. It just feels like no one's trying to actually beat them.
Well, yeah, until you get to that point at the end of the week, of that week, when the left did organise, and then they disappeared. That's what it took. It took for us to organise and get out on the streets. There was many, many more of us than there were of them, and they went away. Right? Obviously, they are still with us in some way, shape, or form.
That's not electorally, is it?
No, it's not electorally, and you know, in some ways. Well, here's basically what I think about that. That as we have to. It's tough. It's tough because of the system that we live in. And we will get further. This is why I ended up doing those assemblies. If we stop waiting for people who have never delivered to somehow miraculously deliver.
Yeah.
There's a African-American essayist and poet, June Jordan. She said, "We are the ones that we've been waiting for," right? We know now. If you didn't know before, we know now that Labour is not going to stand up to these people. That what it's going to do is send the perpetrators to prison and put the policy in Parliament. That's what they did. That's what happened in 1958, when they went hunting black people all over Notting Hill. And then in 1962, we got the Immigration Act. They blamed black people for being attacked. And we got the Immigration Act in 62. Labour, Hugh Gateskill, who was no radical, said this was prejudice legislation, anti-colour legislation, he called it. And then when Labour got into power, they kept it. Actually, they made it even worse. So we know this. We can keep learning there, or we can stop waiting for them. And we can do precisely what you're doing here and organise yourself. Because they will respond. What they will respond to is power and numbers. And if we have the power in the numbers, we will force them to respond to us. Frederick Douglass, abolitionist. Power concedes nothing without a demand. It never has, and it never will. I think that they are potentially lethal. They are potentially the Front National or Geert Wilders or the New Democrats in Sweden. That in this moment where fascism is a mainstream ideology, we can't take any of this for granted. But we also should not diminish our possibility and our potential, and understand that actually when we do rally, and that rallying that sent all those people home, it didn't come from Labour. It barely came from the trade unions, actually.
Well, in fact, the MP there told people not to go. in Walthamstow,
Yeah, I mean, we're in this really aggravating moment where it is understood that racism is bad. It's just not understood that anti-racism is the antidote to racism. And so we and therefore have all of these things, DEI and all these things which are attempt to mitigate the problem but not actually address it. You kind of know the answer, don't you, really? I mean, and it speaks to, I've just been doing this essay for a lecture, a Faber lecture, about the burden of representation. And the burden of representation is such that when black people fail, they fail for everybody, for every black person that there is. And when they succeed, it's a fluke, or it's DEI, or there's some excuse. So we're like an 18th century witch, dunked in the water. If we drown, we're not a witch. If we float, then we're rich, and then they burn us at the stake. I think about 3 days after the kid went into the Southport and killed those poor girls, in Leicester Square, a man called Abdullah ran to the rescue of 2 white women, Australians, who were being stabbed by a white guy. We didn't hear about him. The other guy wasn't even bloody Muslim, and they attacked the mosques. But there's no praise for Muslims. If you have to, and I would argue in both, well, not in both cases, rightly so. Abdullah is not acting as a Muslim, he's acting as a human being when he does that. And the person who goes into Southport, who's neither a refugee, nor an asylum seeker, nor an immigrant, nor a Muslim, is acting by himself. But we don't get the right, and this is why this would be another example of a flaw, a glitch in the kind of politics that is advocated. That black people like to talk, in certain circumstances, black people like to talk about black excellence. And I'm like all for it. Partly for black excellence, or partly, you know, why wouldn't you be? And I've never been in any doubt that black people can be excellent. But I am a really militant advocate of black mediocrity. Why do we have to be excellent? Like, that is not a reasonable amount of pressure to put on a human being to be excellent. That your price to pay for being in this society is excellent. Anything less is not good enough. You can be good enough to play for England, but for fuck's sake, don't miss a penalty. Because if you miss a penalty, you'll be black. If you score, you'll be English. And so this distribution of blame is quite common. And the one that you didn't mention was Catholic Church. Could you imagine if mosques had the history that the Catholic Church has had of sexual abuse and child abuse and so on? I don't think that's all Catholics. But somehow, you know, what happens in Rochdale or is understood to be Muslims. And there is also this way in which these things are racialized. So grooming, or on-street grooming, I think they used to call it, which is it's either paedophilia or prostitution, whatever they do, child abuse, there's already a name for it. We don't need a new name. Rape, all of those things, that's what it is, right? We don't need a new name for that. But they get a new name in the same way that we had a new name, mugging, which was a particular crime that black people did, but the crime existed before. And you have to imagine that we said, okay, we're going to call this thing toff bunking, after Boris, who's got more children than he knows what to do with, who's proven himself to be sexually incontinent. If we add Elon Musk and Donald Trump to that, we have a set.
Boris Johnson was at the inauguration.
Yeah, I can believe that. Of white men who are rich and sexually incontinent. Why don't we give that a name? We don't give a name because it would be stupid. And there's already a name, philanderer or whatever, there are already names for it. So these racialized and racially connoted crimes are then inflicted upon us. And all we can do is kind of, you can't perform yourself out of racism, right? You can't achieve yourself out of racism. You definitely can't earn yourself out of racism. You can make yourself more comfortable within a racist society, but in the same way that a wealthy woman can still be raped, a wealthier black person can still, will still have to deal with certain kinds of racism. And these formulations, these moral panics are sent to try us. And the challenge that we have is not to say, well, there's nothing wrong there. If we're talking about the Northwest and those gangs and what they did, then we have to be as absolutely clear about why that is wrong and why it needs to be put a stop to, and why the sensitivity goes to the children, not that you should deal with anyone insensitively, but that you know, we don't want to get caught in an OJ trap where we start defending things that are wrong because the people who are saying them, you know, we also think are wrong. Because then we're no better than them. As for the Palestine demonstration, I didn't go on this one. I've been on quite a few others. I fear, the last thing you asked was, you know, where's this going? I fear it will go the way of Black Lives Matter and all these other things, so there will be this energy, it won't be incubated, people will go home and then we'll wait for the next war and then we'll all come together again in a different way, which seems to me a shame that, because there's plenty of things that we can be getting on with in the meantime. In a sense, the wars never stop. And there is a connection, as I mentioned, between these wars and the issue of asylum and migration. So there's no reason for it to stop, but unfortunately we have yet to find a home. So that's what I fear, that is what I fear will happen. And this weekend in particular, I mean, it looked like the police overplayed their hand. It looked like a terrible mess. I'm kind of surprised that something like this hadn't gone before, actually. The thing I keep coming back to, two things I keep coming back to about this country in Palestine. The first is that even though our arguments weren't replicated in most of the media, the call for a ceasefire has been pretty consistently the call that in most polls that the British public have supported. So we're doing something right there. Unfortunately, that did not save a single Palestinian life. It may in the future, in the same way that we campaigned against the Iraq war, we didn't stop the Iraq war, lots of people died as a result, but there were probably a bunch of other wars that didn't happen because the pushback on the Iraq war was so massive that they knew that what they were coming into. And I'm naturally a hopeful person. I think no energy is ever lost. And, but sometimes it is dissipated and it's diluted, and that's a shame. But that, given what we were starting from in terms of what people knew about Palestinians, what people knew about Israel, what people knew about Britain's foreign policy, given where this country was, given what happened to Corbyn, I actually think that we have actually managed to do something quite phenomenal, which is convince the British public that from the get-go that this was a bad idea. And in so doing, decouple accusations of anti-Semitism from defense of the Palestinians in a way that, frankly, I don't know that Corbyn really tried that hard. One of my frustrations with him was that these arguments were put, and at a certain point I wanted him to step up and say, look, I back the Palestinians, and some people don't like that. And it may be, this is a sensitive subject, and it may be that I've misspoken in the past, and if I have, I'm sorry, and this is my history of supporting Jewish people in my community, which he has, and this is my history of supporting Palestinians, which he has, and if you can find any contradiction between those two things, then fine, go ahead. There was a speech that he could have made, there was a story that he could have told, and he, for his own reasons, decided not to, and that was I didn't have a problem with his politics, but I wish he had defended them in a more robust manner.
Gary, I tore that page out in The Guardian.
Oh, really?
That kept it, because I thought that was such a good letter he wrote. I thought, I hope he's read this. It happened, you know. But it was, you really got to the crux of it.
Oh, well, thank you.
Very effective. I've got it still.
Thanks, Faiza. All right, let's take some more questions. Okay, should we start at the back this time? Yeah.
Hi. knowing that the left doesn't have any strategic foresight, which has led to its complete destruction, and the fact that the press and media and Labour Party and the Tory Party will never allow electoral reform. When it comes to being strategic, would you say that it would be best for whatever remains of the left to in future attack the Labour Party and that reform gets stuck into the Tories? And knowing that there will still be a large number of Tories who will vote Tory, but there will be a large number that vote reform, in the Parliament we will get an increase in Green, Liberal Democrat, Independent, but also Reform MPs who want PR. And then we can have PR, which means then we can have access to the levers of power. Because otherwise, first past the post, we are going nowhere.
This is the long-term strategy. Yeah. Sorry, there's someone here, Sarah. Thank you.
Hi. Can you touch on money? Paul Marshall is a hedge fund manager, funded and started GB News, bought the Spectator, I think he's bought the Telegraph. Most people probably never heard of Paul Marshall. And I think he's emblematic of the imbalance with what you said, Gary, earlier about centuries of capitalism and use the word power. I mean, you can substitute money. And one of the reasons I think things like BLM didn't sustain, why maybe these protests about Palestine are not going to sustain, is because there isn't money behind it.
For the infrastructure.
I just wonder if you have ideas about how we address that.
And then, sorry, I missed someone. There was, Sarah, do you want to just take it back a few rows? Yeah.
Yeah, Gary, there were several things you said that formed like a thread in my head. One was earlier on when you talked about limitations maybe around the BLM movement and symbolism, getting rid of statues when maybe it's issues like housing and work opportunities. Then you mentioned in your own life that it wasn't just anti-racist struggles, it was, I think you said free meals and an education system. And at one point you said, as a final link in my little necklace, was about the anti-racist struggle has to also know that it's not the only, it doesn't represent the only form of suffering, or something along those lines. And then you were saying, and I guess that's something in my head, that somehow there's the realisation that racism is a material reality, not just a moral question, and that there are other material realities, and how we bring those struggles together. And you ended that kind of thought for me by saying something about the need for us to get together for trade unions, and it's the mechanics of that I'm trying to ask you. How do you see the mechanics of bringing anti-racist struggles and broader material struggles that might bring a unity without subsuming? I mean, it's that old left thing about wait for the revolution. You know, if you're a woman, if you're a minority, the white working class will sort it out for you, and you'd be waiting a long time for that, I think. But how do you see, do you have an idea of how the mechanics of that kind of material unity between anti-racist struggles and all the other struggles we have, and, if you like, working class struggles generally?
Yeah. Thank you. There's one more question here, Sarah. I just want to take in this. Yeah, over here. Yeah.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you. My question was a bit quick. I was going to say, what's your opinions on how knife crime has risen in London? I think 2 weeks ago, a 14-year-old boy got killed in Woolwich. It's out of control now. What's your opinion on it, and what do we need to do?
So, starting with the last one first, because knife crime is something that I actually did quite a lot of work on in The Guardian. And while I would never say that anything like that is easy, there are some fairly clear pointers as to why we are living in the way that we are. And that would be that for some of that story that I told you about, well, and I got my grades and I went to university and blah, 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 some of that's not possible anymore. Partly because of a new Labour government, actually, but that's a separate issue. And so if we underfund child and adolescent mental health services, as we do, if we have policies in schools that encourage schools to exclude students or to off-roll students, if we remove any support for young people who don't come from families of means to stay in school, if we make it more expensive to go to university, and if we shut the youth clubs, then what do we think is going to happen? We are chronically underfunding our youth. And I have lots of criticisms of the police, but this would be one where I actually think the politicians have created a crisis, and then they're giving it to the police to sort out. So the police are picking up kids who aren't well, who aren't in school, who've got nowhere else to go, who sometimes their parents are working 2 jobs, and then we're saying to the police, well, you sort it out. But it's not a criminal problem. Actually, it's a social problem that turns into a criminal problem because of this underfunding. So I do think that there is a kind of pretty standard social democratic response to this that isn't going to solve it, because things like that don't just get solved, but would definitely mitigate it. And one of the barriers to kind of rallying people behind it is that knife crime has become a construct that is only understood racially. And one of the things that happened when we did this report was that, we did a series of articles. It was called Beyond the Blade. It's still up. We managed to get the numbers out of the police forces. Up until that point, because I did a book about all of the kids that got shot dead in one day in America, and we know, because they keep their figures, that there were, when I wrote the book, 7 kids every day were shot dead. Now it's about 12. So when I was asked to do something about knife crime, I tried to find out, well, how many kids get killed with knives? And it was almost impossible to find out. We had to issue a series of freedom of information inquiries. And what it showed, because we got them, was that while death from knife crime in London overwhelmingly, not exclusively, but overwhelmingly affect young black men, in the country that's not true. In the country, more white people die of knife crime than black people. There's something about London that is particularly deadly, because it's not as deadly for black people outside of London. And that in the same way that if you make welfare in America racialized, then you can persuade white people who would benefit from it that it's not for them. And that knife crime has been portrayed as something that is a blight on the black community, as though these black kids aren't all of our kids. And so we have this horrendous situation that people are blaming an entire community for, and understand it as being part of a kind of dysfunction within that community, where it's actually a societal dysfunction. So I think that there are clear things that have to happen before we get to knives. Do you know what I mean? In terms of making sure our children are well and have all the support that they need. I covered this case of a 15-year-old who stabbed another 15-year-old to death. And there were 2 things that happened that they shocked me, and they also kind of told her story, which is at the end, when the boy had been sentenced, they read out a thing from his mum, and that his mum had been writing to an MP, to a councillor, saying, please help me save my son. She told them either he's going to end up dead or someone's going to end up in a body bag. She said to her MP, I don't want my child to become another statistic, and I don't want him to create another statistic. And she said to me when I interviewed her, he is responsible for what he's done. And I'm responsible for what I've done. But they are responsible for the things that they did not do. And I agree. The other thing that was both moving and kind of a bit shocking was that the boy who murdered, his mum came out. I have to thank my dad for this. I'd just been to the toilet, so I was still in the Old Bailey. Everybody else had gone. And the boy whose son had died, she walks into him and they throw their arms around each other. And she says, "I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry." And the man says, "I just wanted justice for my son." And she says, I know. But then the newsline that night was about members of the dead boy's family seeking longer sentences and so on and so forth. But actually quite often, not always, the kids who, and I'm not even saying in this particular circumstance, but the kids who are killed and the kids who kill come from the same community, they come from the same kind of families. This is kind of fratricide, almost. And yet we are stuck in this kind of demonizing narrative of we cover the death, because I think journalism has a lot to say about this, or takes a lot of responsibility of this. They cover the death and they cover the sentencing. That's it. So we don't know what happened, we don't know why, we don't know anything about the communities that they came from, we don't know. You can't name young people, but you can talk about the youth clubs that have been shut down in their area, you can talk about their mental health needs and so on and so forth. So that's why I think about that. I think it's a hard subject, and I think we haven't even started to try. And the criminalising it is the worst possible, well, not criminalising stabbing, but having it as only a criminal issue, it's a public health issue. In Scotland, that's what they did. They made it a public health issue. They got all of the agencies involved, and it made a big difference. Final thing I'll say about it is that stop and search actually makes us less safe. Because, and this is, all of the work that they've done in Scotland says this. They said, look, one of the reasons we could do what we do is because we had some trust in the community. The very community that they need trust with in London, they don't trust them. And you're not going to stop and search your way out of this. Because it's not like black communities don't want this to stop, but they don't trust the police to stop it. And they've good reason not to trust the police. So for all of our sakes, we have to come up with an understanding of both crime and policing that's for our communities and not for the tabloids.
Can I just add to this, actually, because I had a grandma and an auntie of a young person that had stabbed someone and ended up killing them. And they came to an event and they wanted to speak to me because they were like, actually they came before it happened. They said, "I'm really worried about my grandson. We've called, we're trying to get he really needs mental health support. We're really really worried this is going to happen." And like within 2 weeks they'd emailed me and someone had died, another teenager had died. And it just what you said about, really struck me, that here was a family recognizing there was a problem and they just had no support and nowhere to go. And yeah, he's in lifetime in prison now, was 17. So yeah, I just was saying, it just really, you hear that story when you're, in the community and trying to do things, but you never read that story, you never hear that story in the press.
Your plan for us attacking Labour, and I mean, it feels like there's a lot of slips between cup and lip there to me. There's a lot could go wrong with that plan. And that kind of, I guess there are two things for me. The first is that I feel that we just need to concentrate on what we do and what we want and what our agenda is. What are we proposing? What are we for? That being against Labour, particularly at this moment, could, as a primary goal, could actually facilitate the far right, could actually encourage a cynicism. And my primary obstacle isn't Labour, it's neoliberal capitalism and all of the perversions that it produces. And so, which leads us to my second point, which is that I don't really trust the electoral system. I know how it goes with the votes and all of that, but in a moment where turnout is falling and the distribution of votes is more diverse, then that's not particularly where I want to put my energies. And that doesn't mean that other people who do put their energies there are wrong, but that I feel that these political parties will respond to what else is going on, and we have to be part of what else is going on. And trying to kind of triangulate what they might or might not do, I kind of, I'm not so confident in my prognosis as to do that. I think, so to your point about kind of...
money.
Well, there's money. I don't think money is a proxy for power. It can be, but it's not necessarily. George Soros has got lots of money. Was not exactly going his way. If we think about... So I think it helps. I think it helps a lot. But I think there are different pockets of power. So there's power in money and finance, there's power in parliament, there's power in workplaces and unions, there's power in communities, there's a range of sites of power. And definitely we are in a kind of, I think it's the second Gilded Age, there might have been another one in between now and the one that I know about. But if you look at what is going on in America right now, who is gathered around Trump and how, is the money people. And if you look at where their tentacles stretch, in social media, you got Bezos owns the Washington Post, you got Zuckerberg and social media, you've got this range of like every single source is polluted, right? It's like there's arsenic in the water supply. And so we have to find different supply. We're going to have to drink somewhere else. And this is part of that, I think, of not just having a story, but telling a story, amplifying a story, changing the story to include more and more people, all of that. But that's kind of going to be on us. Anyone who's on Twitter, and I'm on Twitter occasionally, anyone who's on Instagram, anyone who's on all these things, that we're all giving these people our information, it's very difficult not to be complicit. It's capitalism. Every time, I just went to Tesco's. Do you know what I mean? Like, we got to eat. So I definitely think that money and oligarchy, more to the point, the way in which money kind of feeds into power is an urgent issue. I think the only power we've got is each other and our organisation and our organisations. And time and again, we've shown that money doesn't always win. It matters a lot, but it doesn't always win. The question about the question which felt like a question about race and class in a sense, and the connection between the two. And I feel that these things already exist. The Black Members Council, most unions have things like that. But they've kind of fallen, they feel to me like they are part of a previous age. And that young people don't necessarily well, they certainly don't relate to unions in the same way, and so they're not gonna. That moment of class-race interaction is not going to be. I think there is a thing of political education here of kind of just emphasising constantly that class politics that doesn't include a race politics is not a class politics. The class politics that doesn't include feminism is not a class politics. That these things that people understand as identity politics, all of them are material. All of them. That if you can't sit with your loved one while they're dying because of your same-sex partnership, that's material. If you're being paid 83p to a man's pound, that's material. If you can't get into a certain building because that's material, it's not just about how you feel. It's about how and whether you can live in the same way as other people. And all too often, and this would be a moment of self-criticism, I feel that there can be a kind of unpleasant moralizing tone to the way that the left talks about and talks to other people. Mm. I grew up in Stevenage. There were very few black people there. And lots of the white people who we knew, who were friends of the family, sometimes they didn't say the right thing. Sometimes they'd say coloured. Sometimes they'd say worse. Sometimes they'd say worse and then they'd come and apologise. And it's not a life that I would want for my kids, particularly, but I have developed an understanding that you can have a world where people know what to say and they're still racist, just more polite racists. That racism is not about a word. It's not about a slur. It's fine for people to talk about microaggressions, but really it's the macroaggressions that we'll really, yes, there are a range of things that I wish didn't happen, but I have to be able to distinguish between deaths in police custody and someone not giving me my proper title, right? That they're not the same thing. And that there is, broadly speaking, in the world, not just on the left, a rush to be offended, which to me is not the same as politics, but people make out like it is politics, like that is the beginning and the end of their politics, that someone said this. And it's like, okay, but first of all, what did they do? And secondly, what are you going to do? But mostly, I remember The Guardian getting some they're black rappers. They were doing a story about black rappers and they got the names wrong, which is annoying and crap. And, if you're black, it falls into a certain kind of slot. They all look the same. I also remember the person who wrote it saying, oh, black people have been calling me, young black people, they're traumatized, they're really upset. And I did think, if that's the worst thing that happens to you, then you're probably blessed. And that doesn't mean that it wasn't wrong. But I think we have to be proportionate. And that sometimes when we're not proportionate, that actually can be quite alienating for people, because they can't see a way in. But for the most part, in my political life, and I got politically engaged during the miners' strike in '84, these things do happen somewhat organically. The lesbians and gays for the miners, that wasn't the miners' idea. There was the black people for the miners, that you had all these moments of people coming in that hadn't been in these areas before. And these are the same areas that kicked off for the summer. And so there is a clear need for a more regular, consistent, institutional, organic relationship between the institutions that we have that have been long-lasting, which are mostly class-based, and both different identity groups and different communities that may not be in the workplace. And that is as much for the unions as it is for everybody else. There was another question, I think.
I think that was it.
Oh, was that it?
Yes.
Did I do them all?
Yes, you did them all.
Score.
Okay, we'll take this one more because we're running out of time. I'm sorry, we'll just take this one here. I know we have to be out of here by 9:30, right? So.
Thank you. Two very short questions. How do you put imperialism back in politics, especially on the left in this country? And how do you push back against someone like me who says the UK and NATO are vassal states of US imperialism?
Okay, so I wouldn't push back on the second one. That's true. And I mean, what's interesting about imperialism in terms of our conversations, our UK conversations about British politics, is it's not that it's off the table. They talk about it a lot, actually. They just don't call it imperialism, and they don't recognise it as wrong. I mean, we've had wall-to-wall Palestine. We've had Yemen, we've had Lebanon. We've had a few encounters with Iraq. We've had Syria. We've got the Ukraine. So to me, it's not that we're not talking about it. It's that we are talking about it in a ahistorical way that doesn't chooses not to acknowledge the roots of these things, and the historic responsibility that grows out of that. Take a country like Sudan, which I know quite well, that Britain was a colonizer, that put all of these, well, particularly these two countries that, what is now South Sudan and North Sudan, together, and made it a basket case, made it there, made sure it would be there. We are just over 140 years since the Berlin Conference, where they carved up Africa. We're still dealing with that. So I think that it's not discussed in its proper historical context, and it's not discussed in terms of accountability and responsibility. So the Mediterranean and the people who are coming through the Mediterranean and trying to get to Europe, where do they go through? Libya. Why? Because it's a failed state. Who failed it? We did. We murdered their leader. With no plan for what comes next. And so what are they doing now? They're just moving the border of Europe into Africa and saying, you do this and we'll give you some money. So, as I said, I don't think that it's that we're not talking about it. I think we're talking about it in a certain sanitized, cleansed way. And it's up for us on the left to be that consistent pain in the ass, thorn in the side, to say, well, what about this? Where did this come from? Who built Osama bin Laden's bomb shelters? We did. Who funded Hamas? Netanyahu, among others. Who did these things? Well, let's actually have that conversation and not be like, yeah, well, stop bringing up old stuff. Because that's what they keep saying. Whenever you root things in their correct historical context, they'll say, yeah, but what about now? As though now is a time distinct from yesterday and distinct from tomorrow. Tomorrow they'll say, well, what about now? So now is this present continuous. It's crazy. And I do think particularly for a country like Britain. What's his name? There was the Danish foreign minister in about 2017, 2018, and he said that Europe is split into countries that are small and countries that have yet to realise they are small. Well, guess which one we are? And guess how painful it is us finding that out. And yet, for those of us for whom our relationship with this country goes beyond the borders and over centuries, we didn't have any choice but to know, right? And the same would be true for people of Irish descent and so on. Other people can learn, and they do learn. But then it's our job as the left to keep saying it. You know, and I will end here. There are people in this country, they will say, we won the war, even if they didn't fight, even if they weren't born. They'll say, we won the World Cup, even if they didn't play, even if they weren't born. And you say to them, what about the massacre of the Mau Mau? What about what you did in Ghana? What about the Bengal famine? They say, I wasn't born. I wasn't there. It wasn't me. It's unsustainable. Power has many parents, but the brutality it takes to acquire it is always an orphan. And it's for us to constantly remind, you gave birth to this. So you are implicated. And that's as true for our foreign policy and imperialism as it is for migration and refugee and asylum seekers.
Gary gave us so many wise words tonight that we're going to put this up on YouTube. Selassie has kindly recorded it for us, and I'm going to go through and write down all his one-liners and use them myself. I just was thinking, you know, it's really, we have these conversations, we're having these discussions, and hopefully, by the way, next month we'll have, either it's going to be someone to come and talk about class, and Mike Savage has come and talk about class, which will follow on quite well from your question, and the British class system, or we're going to have Leanne Mohammed either next month or the month after. So we're just sorting out dates. So watch my emails and my social media for that. And Gary Stevenson, I think, is going to come in May. So we've got loads of these great discussions happening, and I just was thinking, you know, part of the effort to stop me was also to stop this. This is power. This is politics. And I think one of the things, Gary, that really struck me is the difference between the electoral system and politics. And actually, we are engaging in politics. And might ask for you, these events are free. They're organised by a bunch of volunteers. None of us are paid. Gary's not paid.
Sorry,
it's just too. No, this is really.
Sorry. We're all about history, so a bit of history has just been made because whose birthday has it just been? So, happy birthday, Faiza!
My big sister just blew out half the candles.
Happy birthday, dear Faiza. Happy birthday to you. Yay, blow it. Yay. When was your birthday?
It's 2 days on Saturday. Thank you, that's really kind, thank you. We need to get out of this room because, but yeah, I just want to go back to please, like, these are free, please tell people to come, bring a friend. This is for the dreamers, this is for the thinkers, this is for the people that are questioning things, this is for the people that have been changed by what's happened in Palestine. A few people have said that to me. So please keep coming and keep bringing others. This is building power of a different type. And so proud to be part of this. In this room tonight, there are, there's the teachers and the trade union workers, and there's, the people working with domestic violence victims. This is the mixed, class and race room and discussion that we so need. So please keep coming, and just massive thanks to Gary, who we've just been so blessed to have with us tonight. I'm sure you'd agree.